This episode of the Seventh Valkyrie Podcast is brought to you entirely by fan support. To help keep the series ad-free, get early access and bonus features, browse gear and apparel, join the community, or watch the series come to life in living color, you can check out the links in the description. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Seventh Valkyrie Podcast. This one might be a little bit of a deeper topic to dive into. Just as I forget what it was. No, I don't remember what inspired this podcast. I was sent sort of a beautiful article, and it was pointing out that, rightfully so, in the first 10 or 15 years of the 21st century, we've kind of had this strong cultural shift. Cultures have changed quickly. We've globalized quickly. We're kind of comparing all these old traditions are suddenly held under new scrutiny. And there's a lot of aspects of that have been really positive. You've seen a lot of that used for empowerment, but you've also seen a sort of backlash towards that. I would call most of the Make America Great Again movement and kind of the rise of, right-wing sentiment, populist sentiment, was in response to, some of these kind of corrections, and not corrections in terms of like, oh, there's one way right or wrong. Obviously, I have my own opinions that you guys are pretty sure about, but the idea of we've kind of corrected as a society, and I think we overcorrected back, and you're seeing a huge spread of, you're seeing kind of a backlash of like this traditional perspective that really does not want to be ignored. It does not want to go into the good night. And I think, if you read the title of this podcast, one that I'm going to be talking about today is a very complicated topic of masculinity, which is somehow universal and also entirely different to everybody. But to bring this all back around, I was reading this article and it talked about how we've done a lot in the past 15 years to point out and target toxic masculinity and highlight areas of our life. This started honestly before Me Too, but the Me Too movement was huge for that. And since then, there's been a real rise to the cultural consciousness of what toxic masculinity is and why we need to be aware of it. And I think that is super, super healthy. But this article poses a very interesting question of, in the absence of, kind of these toxic masculinity areas, and we're kind of attacking that, there's been sort of a void now of what positive masculinity actually is. And this article then kind of goes into some of the places and how that's been filled with a lot of the alt-right perspective, a lot of these kind of outsider perspectives, guys who are kind of saying, oh, this is how you be a real man in the modern era. And the problem has been that they are very, very enticing, toxic movements. We're talking about like the manosphere kind of thing, like nice guys, incels, kind of this rise of misogyny and hate that has corresponded to, what this article posits is that it's not necessarily that it's just like men are inherently terrible. It's that there's actually been sort of an absence of positive role models and positive masculinity within the discourse. And I think part of it is, and this article kind of agrees, is that we haven't really figured out how to take traditional masculinity and turn it into something positive in the modern era. As a kid, I remember I always found strength and support in looking for role models. I have identified as a man, and I've lived in a heteronormative society for my entire life. And I was talking to my girlfriend recently, who I always find has a very valuable perspective on things like this. And she's kind of in the fan of like, we don't really need to, if we have decided that old masculinity is sort of toxic, why don't we just leave it in the past? Why don't we just try to create something totally new? Or why don't we even, just focus on what makes a good human rather than what makes a good man versus what makes a good woman? Like, why are we in a world where we're encouraging these divides? And I think that's a really valid perspective. But at the same time, for myself, as someone who identifies with that and has identified their entire life, and we live in a world where I don't think we'll ever, we will not in my lifetime will we totally turn into a neutral androgynous society where everyone is on a wiggly spectrum. I think there will be models and stuff, and so I figured that in that current space there is some room to be, to engage with this link between traditional masculinity, which has led us here, and has some possible there's stuff to unearth there, I guess was my point. There is value to be discovered in what traditional masculinity espoused. There is something familiar. It's like cultural iconography. So there is something to be found there, but also I think it needs to be updated. And I don't think anyone would disagree with that updating sort of traditional masculinity to the modern era is valuable. And so I started digging into kind of which elements of this traditional masculinity are worthwhile. And, I was thinking about the ones that had an impact on me that I still hold dear to this day. This is what I've gotten from Tamanis. I talked about that in a previous podcast. From my dad, from father figures, my grandfather, from, other friends of mine's dads, and from my uncles, from just strong, open-hearted men in my life. Ted Lasso, I thought, was a really great example that tackled this topic. And it was actually thinking about Ted Lasso that got me really, wrapping all these ideas and elements around this one concept of kind of fatherhood, of, throughout history, we have, in order to get to you, we had an unbroken chain of fathers. And they may not have been present, they may not have been good fathers, but they certainly were fathers. And it's kind of this ultimate test of, if you were going to continue passing along the, human genes, you will be a father at some point. And so I figured, and that is something that only someone who is uniquely male can do. And so I figured, at least for now, I know we're working on things and, who knows? Anyway, but back to the point, I think it's a good litmus test, and not only that, it's something that we're all familiar with. Everybody knows where fathers have done well in their life. Everybody can point out where fathers have failed, and so it's kind of a universal thing that all men share across all species, all society. Everything else is can vary, but pretty much across the world, that is the one universal truth: is that if you are a man, then you have some association with fathers, whether good or bad. Otherwise the human race wouldn't have continued to exist all the way up until this point. It's an unbroken chain of dads going back. And now, as we all know, getting someone pregnant does not make you a father. If there's, that's the kind of bare minimum, at which point you're a zero or whatever. And then you kind of can be, all your dad points start after that. But it's one of the hardest jobs to do well, and I thought, hey, shit, this is a great metaphor. We know instinctively what a good father is, what a bad father is, and we know that these are important values. And I also want to kind of as a sidebar say you don't actually have I don't think that everyone here has to have children. I think it's a totally responsible decision to say, hey, I personally don't need to, but I felt like it was just such a universal symbol. And yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to do, is I wanted to kind of provide through the lens of what makes a good father versus a bad father, talk about, what we can model as a role for positive masculinity. And for me, that felt like a good way to kind of bridge this historical past of traditional, elements associated with fatherhood with kind of how those apply to the modern era. And very quickly before we hop in, I don't think these are male exclusive virtues. I think these are universal virtues, and that's important to me. But I hope that kind of by highlighting how they were expressed traditionally, in what we know as masculinity, and how they can be expressed now, it can kind of offer a bridge and offer a gap and an alternative for guys who are out there who maybe identify themselves as a man and identify with this historical group, and have found strength and support and value in being part of male spaces, but also our understanding that we live in a world that's evolving very, very quickly. And so I kind of thought this would be a nice way to kind of bridge the two. I'm not a historian or a theorist on gender studies. So if there are gaps here, I'm totally down to debate them, but I just thought I'd kind of pitch this in as my little, contribution to the conversation. So let's get into it. And I think that the 7 elements of historical masculinity that I think are particularly relevant in the modern era are these, and I think they actually build on each other. So first is generosity, which is only accomplished through personal mastery. So the model for a man throughout history has been to master yourself and your skills and then grow to the point where you can provide for others. I think this kind of captures a lot of childhood, and you are traditionally, you become a man when you can begin to provide. And I think that's pretty fundamental, and it has been throughout history. And I think that that's something that we can take with us, getting yourself, like, this doesn't have to be through your own children. It can be through as a community or as a member of a society, but getting yourself to the point where you are emotionally, physically, and spiritually strong enough to be giving back to others, and then you work throughout your life to do so. That to me is how you bridge provider into, a world of a modern world. Next is health, which I think is, something universal. I don't think that really needs to change all that much. Although we've added, in addition to physical health and physical strength, we've added emotional resilience and emotional strength. The first learnings that we get as a person, no matter who you are, is how to take care of yourselves so that we don't have to depend on others to be physically, spiritually, and emotionally happy. Now, that doesn't mean we can't rely on people. And, it doesn't mean that a real man can't be, a real person who is following this traditional masculinity can't work on their physical, mental, or emotional health. In fact, working on that stuff is applauded. But it means a priority and realizing that your emotional, physical health, like in maintaining that and putting in your own effort for that, is important to being able to contribute and being able to give back to your family, to your society, to your children. And I think that idea of continuing to improve yourself and staying vigilant continues on with the third pillar, I think, which is growth in your mindset. Having a growth mindset. Before this was, and the toxic version of this is sort of being obsessed with achievements, always needing to win, always needing to compete, always needing to put other people down. The idea that you're not first, you're last. These are how things, may have negatively, this idea that you need to grow, you need to continue improving. It's like, and people haven't known how to do that, and so you ended up with conquerors and, on one hand, and you had explorers on the other. But, the positive here is that regardless of what you choose to do, we now know that you can continue to grow and evolve in ways more so than just your finances and your physical strength and how many people, of an army you command. And I think that the positive here is to continue to learn and grow throughout life. It is being willing to grow and seek out higher challenges, valuing effort and personal growth, and having a willingness to improve. And that, I was starting to get into kind of how these things shape morality, which is why another pillar here is integrity. Having a sense of what is right and wrong and being willing to uphold those values and stand up for what you believe in. Now, this can be, being tied to values, I think, is dangerous, absolutely. And so I don't think, integrity is rigidity. I think integrity is formed by constantly testing the world, your hypothesis and what you think with the world around you. And then, but taking seriously the positions you hold, understanding that, like, we all have a responsibility to stay strong to values, to act well when we're not being looked at, and being willing to stand for something and to be a person. These are what we look to. The great figures are people who stood for something, and I think that that's an element. That even if you're not necessarily correct, and like I said, it doesn't mean that you have to be uncompromising or totally rigid, but I think there is an element of being willing to, when the chips are down, being willing to stand up for something. I think that's a big part of integrity. And on the flip side is doing the right thing when you're not being asked. Integrity means sticking consistent to values, not as a performative method, but as, a belief of how you should face the world. Sorry, I'm getting a text. Need to send it. Blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to keep rolling. We're doing great. Hey, just 10 minutes or so. I will actually cancel that. Cool. But, integrity is nothing if it's not tempered, and not, balanced with empathy, this willingness to understand and approach people. And I think combining empathy, integrity, and a growth mindset is really how you reach this kind of moral center. You have values, but you're willing to change them and evolve them and learn new things, and they come through the emotional center of empathy. Like if you can't, and I think empathy is an underrated value in men, and I think that it's the factor that truly defines what I look at as a good father in the modern era. And it's something that you find, it's harder to find throughout history, but I think when you look at like the great wise men, that's kind of, when we look at the wise men, and almost it's considered a factor that, or something that's not learned until like you're very, very old, and I think it's something that we're getting better at now. But this idea of true wisdom and empathy, of being able to understand others, like if you cannot understand others, their struggles and their fears, no matter how different they are from you, then you cannot be a father, because a child is a strange blessing that right now, if you're a father in these eras, it's like they are growing up in the most turbulent, bizarre time in recorded history. A true father, like a true parent, is able to understand and connect with the world through eyes as foreign as a newborn child's, and is able to appreciate and respect femininity, because you have to be a part of, you have to understand mothers, you have to understand daughters. Half of fathers ever have had a daughter, if not more than half. I think it's definitely more than half. You have to be able to be a father to a daughter. And that means being willing to accept that, for all that we might, this might be a list of masculine traits, you have to be able to understand the opposite and people different than you and in different cultures, because that's what you need. And now we've gotten into a lot of sympathy stuff, or not sympathy, like moral stuff. I don't know why I said sympathy, but I was just talking empathy. But we talked about a lot of kind of serious stuff. But another part of, I think, being a good father and a model here is joy. I think that the pursuit of joy and love and happiness is something that every young man learns from the men around them. And obviously from women, but I think it's, they also learn it from the men. And I think you can get positive models of this and poor models of this. I remember as a young man being taught the pleasures of life, from the simple love and like the outdoors and the thrill of adventure, to like when I was growing up, like the enjoyment of mischief, and then like as you get older, like you start learning that people really, that like like guys love to eat food and like go play video games and fight and have partnerships and friends and date girls and have sex, and and these are all ways that you can find a healthy way to at their best are it's people showing that there are joyful things in this life that you can share. And obviously people have problems with addiction and yada yada yada, and that's where things become toxic. And if you right now we have problems where people seek out sex to the without understanding how, and without understanding how to do so respectfully and how to take care of yourself, and and so they're told that they deserve sex anyway. So that's a whole other thing in the masculine community. But I think in the positive aspect here is joy. You want to teach and pass on the ways that you are discovering to experience joy, whether that's emotional, physical, like spiritual. And I think that's the positive aspect of it, is trying to pass along that, the discovery of joy. And another kind of soft skill, I think, is courage. And this comes back to, I absolutely do not think you need to have courage to be you don't have to be a man to have courage. And I think that in the modern era, men are almost called upon less to have courage, because many of the challenges in front of us have been solved. And so it's kind of this weird idea of, like now that the world has been conquered, everyone's just kind of like, well, I shouldn't have to be afraid. And courage, you have to be afraid. You have to do things you are scared of in order to have courage. And if you look throughout history, at least into classical and super ancient stuff, courage has always been a value. And it has not been a value of always being brave and doing everything easy. It has been facing insurmountable odds. It has been doing things because you are afraid of them. And the willingness to challenge yourself, to challenge injustice, to challenge friends, to challenge established norms, that is courage. Like, it's being willing to do things that are scary. And now that we live in a world where things are now becoming sort of emotionally scary, and we have to learn how to be emotionally vulnerable rather than just like, oh, I'm going out to fight a dragon, it's more complicated and it's hard. Like the willingness to be able to make amends for your own mistakes and like to face your own failures, that is scary and hard, but that's what I think we need to continue modeling people after. So those are kind of my 7 pillars. I'll highlight them again. You have generosity, you have health, you have growth, you have integrity, empathy, joy, and courage. And as you can see, and this is to get back to my end, I had sort of a word on inclusivity here. Like I said, I talked extensively with my girlfriend around this, who has a lot of different perspectives. Raised very different than I am, identifies very differently than I am. And we had a lot of emotional intensity because she has not had so much in her life positive experiences with traditional male and masculine energy, and I have. So it's kind of a very different perspective to be coming from, and that's why I like to talk with her, because it's so different from mine. It always makes me refine what I believe in. Anyway, but what she said is she was looking at those, and she said, these are universal concepts. Like the same thing that make a good father are what make a good parent, and they're the same thing that make a good man, and they make a good person. We shouldn't feel a need to say, oh, well, these are only for men, or these are only for like people who are going to try to be a dad, or anyone who even identifies with the word dad. And I definitely agree. I think that these are universal concepts, and these are things that anyone can learn from. But I think that what they provide is like I said, they provide a framework for us to discuss, okay, as we look through history, maybe these are the characteristics that we were looking at, and maybe the toxic versions of these are what we need to be a little bit, that are seductive, and we need to be aware of them. It's kind of that culturally ingrained effect of, yes, these are for everybody, but if we look at them through the lens of fatherhood and we look at them through the lens of masculinity, we're able to kind of provide a little bit more. It's a little bit more familiar, and I remember it being more familiar to me when I thought, I could think about, oh, wait, I could follow 7 things and they're all important. I was like, oh, or just be a good dad. And then when you think about the ways that you can be a good dad, clearly, it just makes sense. So anyway, this has kind of been actually it's been a pretty long podcast, but this has been a blast getting to talk to you guys. And in summary, I mean, like, you can't be a good parent without getting your shit together first. And I think that the standard we hold a truly wonderful parent to requires being even better than a normal person, because you don't have to be just good for yourself. You have to be able to support a family and a community. And I think that is really the key difference here is, if we can hold ourselves, if as a group of, positive male role models, if you hold yourself to a higher standard and you want to put something out there, be a good dad. It's not about being greedy. It's not about getting laid. It's not about, having as much money as you can. Though, understand there are elements of those desires that we can draw from, of wanting to be successful, of wanting to provide, of wanting to have physical and mental strength, wanting to be healthy, wanting to be sexually powerful and enjoy that experience and connect with people on that level. But it's not the way that this kind of direction has been going in. So anyway, this is a long podcast. Thank you guys for all listening. I thought this was kind of a fun topic to dive into. And I will talk to you guys next week, maybe with something a little more brief. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Seventh Valkyrie Podcast, which is brought to you entirely by fan support. To help keep the series ad-free, get early access and bonus features, browse gear and apparel, join the community, or watch the series come to life in living color, you can check out the links in the description.